A new novel released this month gives a unique perspective on the Southwest and Native culture. Shutter is a crime thriller with a touch of supernatural horror and a coming-of-age story. The book follows a young woman from the Navajo Nation who becomes a forensic photographer working for the Albuquerque Police Department, but she's hiding a secret. She can see ghosts. This week, correspondent Antonia Gonzalez speaks with Danae writer and filmmaker Ramona Emerson about her debut book.
Ramona, welcome to New Mexico in Focus.
Thank you, Antonia. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're already well known for your filmmaking. Now here we have an acclaimed debut novel, Shutter, different form of storytelling for you. How did this book come about?
Well, I couldn't, 5 years ago I would have told you I don't even know if I could make it happen. I've never thought of myself as a fiction writer. Even the beginning of that particular book started out as a documentary idea. I thought maybe I would like to do a documentary about Navajos who deal with death in their jobs, people like police officers, doctors, pathologists, scientists, and talk about what is ingrained, how is death so foreboding for Navajo people, and why do we have our beliefs? And so I started doing research on that, but in the process of doing that I realized that I don't know if it would make a great documentary. Not a lot of people wanted to talk to me about that, so it kind of put a squash on that, but at the same time I started to think about my own life working as a forensic videographer here in Albuquerque and how that would make an interesting story. So I kind of did an introspective and started to think, well, maybe other people don't want to talk about it, but I can talk about it. I dealt with it for 16 years, and then it started. It was a very long 10 years of writing in between film projects and in between parenting and all the craziness of life. So it took me 10 years to finish it, but I'm really happy with where it ended up.
So how much of your life, you're from the Navajo Nation. I really connected with the grandmother in the story. I was really close with my Navajo grandmother. So how much of it are people going to find that you put in with your own life experiences?
Well, I think almost all of the stuff with the grandma and the character comes from things that my grandma and myself did. I grew up with my grandma a good portion of my childhood, and those are real things that we experienced and things that she would talk to me about, and I think pretty much all of that is part of me. I may have embellished here and there, but those are my memories. And growing up in Tohatchi, I really wanted to make Tohatchi a character of the book because that's my hometown, and it's really important for me to showcase it and talk about it the way I always remember it. And some of it's taken from my own experiences working as a forensic videographer, and just thinking about how my work impacted my emotions and how I would think about people who I filmed for legal reasons for years, for months. Their stories and their lives would impact me deeply, and I kind of used those emotions and gave them to Rita in a different way. Of course, I didn't see ghosts, and I didn't communicate with ghosts while I was working forensics. That would have probably made it a little easier, but I was able to use my emotions that I had working those cases and give them to Rita as kind of a supernatural power instead, because they evoke the same emotions in her, and she would think about their families and who they left behind, and that's what motivates you to do that kind of work.
And to add to that, it is a crime and supernatural aspects of this book, and we know there are a lot of taboos out there in tribes across the country, just not Navajo Nation, but a lot of tribes. So how did you approach that? Are you worried, or were you worried about any backlash or any criticism?
I am worried. And I have to say, when I was in the process of writing it, I would often say, oh geez, are you gonna write that? Are you gonna put that in? What would your grandma say? I had those internal dialogues with myself. How are Navajos gonna take this story? And I realized that I did a lot of research about death and about how Navajos came to this pinnacle of being so afraid of death that you don't even talk about it. It's not something that's even supposed to be a part of your life. And I began to realize that looking at other cultures and looking at other rituals around the world, and doing deep research about all these how different people believe and how different people think about it, I kind of felt that the Dene are real anchored to the Spanish flu, and I think the Spanish flu epidemic really had a huge impact on how Navajos feel about death and their fear of it. Because before that, the research really doesn't show that. It's like they're moving on to the next world. It's a rebirth. And then at some point, it turns into this evil monster. And for me, I felt like this is a good time to have these discussions. Instead of hiding from them, we need to face them. And I think that a lot of people, like the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission, are even starting to talk about traditional funeral practices and about how we deal with death. And so I think even in mainstream academia, we're starting to really think about that and wonder if there's a different way to approach things. And so I thought that it would be a good opening for dialogue. But at the same time, I also thought, well, you know, for decades, Dene have been reading Tony Hillerman, and he talks all kinds of spooky stuff that I would never put in a book, never. And they read those books. So reading something like this that I know I didn't put any sensitive knowledge in because I know better, that they should be fine reading this book. And if we want to have a discussion about death and we want to talk about those taboos, now's the time to do it.
We know there are a lot of non-native writers out there who are writing about the Navajo Nation, who are writing about other tribes across the country. So what does it mean for you as an Indigenous person, as a woman, to be sharing and telling a story through this book, something that we understand and we know, you know, what the do's and don'ts of?
Well, I think it really illustrates the importance of having somebody from a community represent that community and tell that story. Because not only do you get falsehoods and stories written about people or written about us from people outside of our communities, I think there's a lot of falsehoods. I think there's a lot of chance for romanticizing our way of life. There's a lot of chance to stereotype us. And that continues to happen, and it always boggles the mind to me. I never tell stories outside of my community because, I mean, even if I was going to tell a story about a Pueblo community, I make sure that they have exhausted every resource to find somebody from their own community to do that. And if they don't find somebody, at least we can include some young people as part of the project. So they're in development. There will be somebody who can take over these stories after, you know, I'm gone. But that's really important to me. Even through my film work, it's always been a real thorn to me to find people who continue to make these stories and continue to get funded to tell our stories when our own Indigenous filmmakers are struggling to make ends meet, are struggling to have their projects financed. So for me, it's a big stick. So writing a book like this, I think, really shows that deep understanding of cultural taboo, the deep understanding of what stories you tell, what stories you have the right to tell, what stories that you should be telling. There are some stories that you should not be telling, and a lot of those people who don't come from our communities are telling that stories when they shouldn't. And, you know, I can't stop that from happening. People are going to do what they do. But the trick is to have these discussions so that people understand why it's wrong. People understand why you don't tell that story. Out of respect, out of traditional belief, you don't tell that story, or you only tell that story during a certain part of the year. You know, people don't understand that because they don't come from our communities. So it's really important to educate these people.